let's talk about the right order when it comes to pasta. Pasta is a dish that a lot of people like. And you talked about the difference between pasta, having it before having a certain veggie. I'll let you talk about that veggie versus having it after having that veggie. Can you break that one down?
Yes, and I love pasta. So when I first put on a glucose monitor and I was going through this whole process, I was like, I need to figure out how to eat pasta without a glucose spike because it's non-negotiable. I grew up eating so much pasta and Parmesan. It's like I still eat Parmesan every single day. I probably have eaten like 2,000 pounds of the thing now that I've been on this earth for 30 years, but I love pasta. So I had to figure out how to eat it. Pasta is a starch. So if you eat it on its own, it's going to create a big glucose spike. What I devised was this very cool trick that actually merges two hacks. So before I have a big plate of pasta, I will have a salad. So like green leaves, arugula, rocket, spinach. And then I will make a vinegar dressing on the pasta. And if I have the salad before the pasta, I'm able to lower the glucose spike of the entire meal by 50%. So we're talking, I just had the pasta that I love, but I'm cutting the glucose spike in half, which means half the amount of inflammation, half the amount of aging, half the amount of weight gain, half the amount of crazy hormonal dysregulation and, cravings appearance in the afternoon. So, vegetables with vinegar before starches. Super, super important. The fiber in the veggies coats your intestine. The vinegar in the veggies tells your muscles to absorb the glucose really quickly as it lands in your bloodstream. And as a result, you're able to enjoy the starches without so many consequences. However, if you have the pasta first and then you have the salad, you don't see this big impact. The order of the food is important. It's important to eat the starches after the vegetables to get all these benefits.
So put yourself in a typical situation where people are going out to dinner
Mm-hmm.
and the sequencing of sort of the bread, the appetizers and the entrees that come in and dessert. Um, Talk about the consequences of doing it in the typical way and
Mm-hmm.
contrast that with, and you write about this inside of your book, you put people through these different scenarios. Talk about that with the contrast of a different way that we could go about things to protect
So,
our body.
typical thing, you sit down, you're starving, they serve you bread as you're looking through the menu. Typical thing, you reach for the bread and you eat a whole lot of bread. Now, what's happening is that the bread is landing in your stomach. There's nothing else in your system. Very quickly, it breaks down into glucose and ends up in your bloodstream. So before you've even started your meal, you're already starting to see this glucose spike. Then you eat your regular meal, and maybe 45 minutes in, your glucose levels are starting to crash from the bread that you ate first. As a result, the craving center in your brain activates, and it's like, Drew, you're super hungry, eat more. And then dessert time rolls around and they ask you if you want a dessert. And you're like, oh my God, yes, I need a dessert. I need sugar. I need something sweet. That's because your glucose is dropping from that piece of bread that you had at the very beginning. Now, new way to go to the restaurant. Glucose goddess way of eating. They serve the bread. You're like, that looks really tasty. I'm going to have it in 5 minutes. You order a vegetable-based starter. It can be anything. It can be beans, it can be sauerkraut, it can be kimchi, it can be broccoli, tomatoes, whatever. You have that first. Then you have your main with the bread. And actually it's quite helpful because when you have the bread during the main, you can actually use the bread to sauce everything, which I love doing. But most importantly, you're still eating the bread, but because of the fiber that's in there from the vegetable starter, you don't have this big glucose spike. And as I mentioned in the beginning, when your glucose levels are steadier, your hunger hormones are steadier as well. So it's time for dessert, and you probably don't really crave anything sweet. So maybe you just split dessert with your friends instead of feeling like you need an entire, apple crumble to yourself. And so you're starting to feed your body in a way that makes it happier. You feel better mentally. You realize that it's not a willpower issue. It's really just what you put in is actually going to make you feel a certain way. And if you eat to keep your glucose levels steady and balanced, you're going to feel amazing. It's going to feel like a superpower. Your body's going to become your friend, and it's going to be a whole new world.
That's it. You're unlocking a whole new world. We talked a lot about some of the shorter term consequences of not having our glucose balanced and our blood sugar balanced. I'd love to touch on some of the longer term things that are there. I'll see these different posters sometimes that life is short, eat whatever you want, do the things that you want to do. And listen, I want people to eat whatever they want to eat, and I want people to just be happy. And if you're happy, amazing. And if we can reduce some human suffering along the way, that's a beautiful place. Leave the world a better place than we came across this. What a lot of people don't understand is that it's not just about not having optimal focus. It's not just about not feeling your best. It's not just about hunger and weight gain. There's other chronic diseases that are directly tied into irregular and crazy blood sugar. So let's talk about the first one. And this is laid out inside of your book. And that first one that I want to talk about is cancer. What do we know about cancer and its connection to blood glucose?
The main connection we see here is that cancer is a disease that is linked to inflammation. And as I mentioned, every time a glucose spike happens in your body, you increase your inflammation levels. So as a result, the terrain for cancer to grow is just much more fertile. Another thing I mentioned was the free radicals that your mitochondria release whenever there's a glucose spike. These free radicals, as I mentioned, anything they touch, they damage. If they touch your DNA, they damage it. And these damages can actually be the mutations that start the proliferation of cancer, that start those cells that are dividing endlessly and that create tumors. And in the studies, it's very clear. You can see that people who eat in a way that spikes their glucose levels more have a higher risk of developing cancer. And it's becoming, it's everywhere. I think the stat is 1 in 3 children born today are going to get cancer in their lifetime. It's everywhere, and it's very connected to our food. Now, obviously, there are other things that play, for the development of cancer. You have the big ones like smoking, stress, lack of exercise. There's a lot of power in our plate. And the issue with these chronic diseases is that you don't know you have them until you get diagnosed. And so often it's difficult to think, okay, I'm going to do these things to prevent diseases that I might not even get. But the cool thing about the glucose hacks is that they kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Not only are you going to feel better today, because you're not going to have any more cravings, your skin is going to get better, your sleep is going to improve, but you're also helping long-term your body not develop cancer and other diseases. So it's really fundamental to today and tomorrow.
What's crazy is that, we live in a time where if somebody goes on WebMD and there's an article that was written, I think it was like 6-7 years ago, and WebMD tries to, bust myths. And so one of the articles that was there was, does sugar cause cancer, right? Does sugar cause cancer? Now, there's no one thing that causes cancer. There's a lot of play in. But inside of that article, one of the things that they were saying was that there's really not that understanding and connection between sugar and cancer. And I remember having one of the top researchers in the field of angiogenesis, Dr. William Lee, on my podcast. And I asked him about that article and asked him to break it down. And he was saying that just because we don't yet fully understand the mechanism at the level of the doctor's office and public communication doesn't mean that there's not a connection with the root factors that are connected to that chronic disease. So yes, do we have a big double-blind placebo-controlled trial of sugar and cancer? No, but there's a ton of information talking about how cancer cells have more receptors for sugar than they do compared to healthier cells. And that if we want to starve the cancer, one of the things we can do is, of course, fast. But another thing that we can do is cut off one of their food sources that is part of their growth, which is sugar. So what is required for us now, especially if we're all trying to be the CEO of our own health, is we have to be willing to start connecting the dots and understand that before somebody officially says, just like with smoking, we knew that there was a connection between smoking and cancer for such a long time, But finally, when the government got around to stamping and saying, yes, we know, smoking can cause cancer, we're now 30 years, well
Oh
beyond
yeah,
what
a
the
lot of
research
people
has
got
shown.
sick. It's
A lot
like,
of people got sick.
don't turn skepticism into inaction. These things, changing the way you eat to keep, for example, your glucose level steady, or trying to reduce the amount of sugar in your diet, the impact is going to be positive. Like there are very few downsides to this. And so in my world, I would rather do these things to potentially have an amazing upside, knowing what I know about the biochemistry of our body, and not wait for that double-blind, placebo-controlled trial to come out. Because also, Drew, who's going to pay for that trial? And who's going to authorize that trial? We're talking, essentially, to do it, we would have to take two groups of people. One group, feed them a sugar-based diet for 60 years, and the other group not, and then measure who gets cancer or not. I mean, that's never going to happen. It's just never going to happen.
It's so true. And we have to understand that, especially when we're talking to our primary care provider, is that in addition to the fact that many people know on this podcast that physicians, well-intentioned, don't get a lot of education in nutrition, are struggling
Absolutely.
with their own aspects of nutrition, weight gain, focus, addiction, all those components. There's another component, which is once you are done medical school, your exposure to the literature is quite limited unless it's a passion of yours.
Yeah, you don't have time. Also, being a doctor is very time consuming. Like, you don't have
It's
time to look at the
extremely
latest
time consuming.
literature. Yeah.
Right. So we kind of have to do a little bit of our own digging in addition to educating them along the way if they're open to this process. Your book is a great resource. We recommended other great books that are out there too. And understand that they don't have to be, they can be part of our team, but they're not the CEO of our team. You're the CEO of your team, and you're the person that's in charge. And health starts first with what you're doing at home with all the lifestyle factors, including all the things that we're talking about with diet. Hey, YouTube, if you enjoyed what you just saw, keep watching for more great content on how to improve your brain and your life.
For North Americans, particularly, the weight loss thing is a huge impact. Like that's a huge health benefit right there from fasting. So, but in terms of longevity,